Så. Nu filmer den.
Okay, in today's episode is presented by BBC Front Row Gang. Does Great Britain owe an apology to India for their past actions in the time of colonization? Should Great Britain pay reparations to India, or should we let the past be past? That is some of the questions that we will answer today by clarifying the different views and standing points on this topic. And to do that, we have brought in two guest speakers. Now, a short introduction of our guest speakers. First, we have Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He is an Indian politician and writer, former international diplomat. He was born in England, but raised and lives in India. And he has a career in the United Nations and as an Indian politician. He believes that Great Britain should pay reparations as a symbol of goodwill towards India. And we have a quote from him. "We are not talking about reparations as a tool to empower anybody. They're a tool for you to atone for the wrongs that have been done." And on the other hand, we have Akhilesh Pillalamari. He is an international relations analyst and writer for the diploma. He has a master in international security. To contrary, he does not believe that Great Britain should pay reparations to India. So these are our two guest speakers. During this podcast, we will uncover their opinions and look further into their arguments.
So we'll start by presenting some of the views they have during the life under the British influence. First, we'll talk about that Dr. Tharoor says that they suffered from a lot of segregation, racism, and discrimination during the time of the British Empire. He states that between 15 and 29 million Indians died because of the British-induced famine. For example, in the Great Bengal Famine during the Second World War, where 4 million Indians died because Churchill chose to give the supplies that were supposed to go to Bengal to European reserve stockpiles. He said that lives of the Europeans were more important than the lives of the Indians. So 1/6 of all British forces that fought during the World War I were actually Indians. 54,000 Indians lost their lives, 65,000 were wounded, and 4,000 remained missing or imprisoned. India paid up to what corresponds to £100 million during the war. They supplied 70 million rounds of ammunition, 600,000 rifles and machine guns, 42 million garments, and 1.3 million Indians served in the war. They also had to supply 73,000 animals, 370 million tons of supplies. The cost of all these things in today's worth of money is about £8 billion. India was experiencing poverty and recession. And after the Second World War, Britain owed India £1.25 billion that were never actually paid. On the counterpart, we have Pillalamari, who acknowledges the opposition. He states that Indians became the secondary elite of the British Empire, who were all volunteers, and they became wealthy moneylender classes. Other than that, he reports that Indian bureaucrats were in charge of many parts of India, and he sees the upper caste Hindus as products of the elite Indian classes who still neglect the lower classes. So he claims that there are just as many pros as cons of this dilemma.
Yes. Another point that they both make arguments about is the economy and infrastructure of India during the colonization of the British Empire of India. And first of all, Dr. Shashi Tharoor makes an argument that India, as a quote here says, India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived on its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4%. As well as that, he also points out that India went from having 27% of the Finnish cloth trade to less than 2% of the global cloth trade. Because when the British came into India, they broke the looms of these professional weavers, and they put a lot of heavy tariffs on cloth, which made it impossible for people to actually keep on doing this profession, and it put a lot of people on the streets. He also points out that India was a very profitable colony and the biggest importer of British goods, and that the British made a lot of money from India and to the damage of India and benefit of Britain, so they should pay some reparations back. And he also points out that foreign aid to India is from Britain is less than India actually uses on fertilizer, as he jokingly points out. On the other hand, we have Akhilesh Pillalamari, who first again acknowledges the truths to Shashi's points, but counterpoints with the fact, with this quote, among others: the majority of Indians lived in rural India, barely above sustenance levels before, during, and after the British Raj, with little changes to their daily lives and social structure, as had been the case during the empires of previous Muslim and Hindu rulers. So as he points out, India, a lot of India was not heavily affected by the colonization economically. Some people were, some people were not. He also points out that the GDP didn't fall as much as it didn't fall at all during the colony. It just didn't rise corresponding to the Western countries such as Britain, Germany, America, and other countries such as that. And he believes the reason for this is the lack of scientific and industrial infusion. So they didn't get the machines and the scientific advancements that some of these Western countries did. He does, however, acknowledge that the reason for this lack of scientific and industrial infusion is because of some of the legislation that Britain had in India. He also points out the inability to adapt that he believes is a possible cause for some of these Eastern Asian countries to have suffered so much during the colonization. He points out that China as well had a lot of issues, while countries like Japan did not have the same issues because they were able to adapt more quickly and better than India. He points out lastly that the majority of the money made by taxation of India was actually spent in and on India, on Indian infrastructure, and also that a lot of Indians traveled with the army, with the British Army, and became a rich moneylender classes in other countries such as Burma and Uganda. Shashi also points out that he has a counter argument to someone who had been earlier on in his night of debate, who talked about infrastructure, talked about roads and railways, but he points out that the Britain roads and railways in India was purely built for the benefit of Britain and British investors, also Scottish investors, and this was actually some of the things that cemented the Scottish and British alliance during this time. He points out that the only reason they built this railroad was to transport materials, raw materials to the port where they could be shipped to Europe, and they had no attempt to match local needs. And they were also paid for with Indian tax money. He also points out that a lot of countries during this time built their own railways and built their own roads independently, and that India could have done the same without the interference of the British Empire. Akhilesh then counters this argument by saying that the railways didn't actually hurt any Indians and they weren't built out of malice. And in some cases, they were actually still useful and they are still part of the infrastructure today. And then he points to the fact that that railways in Britain were also built in this to make most sense economically, and therefore it was not an isolated case of them being built purely for industry in India. It was the same way in Britain. So it wasn't them not taking care of India, it was just them taking care of their economic interest first. He also points out that Britain helped secure the strategic space around India and also around the coast of India, where a lot of this all-volunteer Indian army was stationed from coast to coast.
Yes, but let's return to the main question. Should Great Britain pay some sort of compensation back to India? We've now covered the segregation, which the Indians experienced, the discrimination from the British, or well, the discrimination the British did against the Indians, and we've covered economical aspects and infrastructure. But what we have in front of us here is a map of the world. And if we could just show everyone, every country that has ever been to war quickly, by tapping the mouse. Here we see that, as Akhilesh points out, every single country on earth has been to war. They have invaded another country. And therefore, if we should make up who owes who what, then it will be an endless piece of, like an endless equation. We will never really find an answer. And he argues that our time should be spent in another way. Whereas Mr. Shashi Tharoor would say that we should somehow try and pay back, as we saw with the quote earlier. But diving down further into this, Shashi Tharoor claims that the diamond Koh-i-Noor, which was originally found in India and kept in Indian civilizations until the British colonized it, should be returned. It is today stored in Great Britain, where Mr. Akhilesh would say that this diamond in particular should not be returned, as there is many more diamonds actually in Tehran in Iran, which is kept. These diamonds were originally Indian as well, but they have been stolen by Iranians from raids through old times. So therefore, this is a constantly ongoing debate. And if we look at countries like Mongolia, Akhilesh points out that a country like Mongolia has colonized before and has invaded. If we go back to the times when Genghis Khan ruled Central Eurasia, many would say that he owes people apologies as well. But today we don't see anyone claiming Mongolia owes them anything, because Mongolia is in another economical situation. And that's also an aspect Akhilesh points out, that countries develop and countries really change over time. Mongolia is nowhere near the great power they once were. So that's what keeps this debate going for a very long time. It's two very well-funded sides with two very, very good arguments for both sides that keep on going against each other. And therefore, this will forever be a key debate in history, whether we should separate ourselves from it or we should constantly try and dig in and make everything right again. Og sådan er det.